I recently spent the weekend in Davenport, Iowa. One of the main attractions here is called the Sky Bridge. Enclosed by glass, the Sky Bridge lights up at night in a series of neon colors, creating a show that one need not be under the influence to describe as trippy. But it gets weirder. Because the Sky Bridge isn't actually a bridge, it doesn't go anywhere. You take an elevator to the top, walk to the other side, and then take an elevator down. You don't cross any roads, any rivers, or any obstacles. The reason I'm telling you all this is that I'm sure some of you are beginning to believe that studying ethics is much like taking a walk on the Sky Bridge. Lots of flashing lights, but really a useless and extravagant waste of time. Now, I can't agree with you here. I really do think that ethics, and more generally philosophy, are useful to us as humans. But suppose they are the equivalent of an academic sky bridge. I don't think this is a reason to abandon them. Why? Well, because even though Davenport Sky Bridge led nowhere, I absolutely loved it. It was beautiful. It was different. It was interesting, and I can honestly say that it made my life a richer one. In this way, I can agree that seeing the Sky Bridge is much like studying philosophy. At this point, though, I've managed to waste a good amount of time talking about my weekend and no time at all covering today's reading. And so on to the ethics of Sir W. D. Ross. You'll notice I said Sir. That's right, the author of our reading was knighted back in 1938 for national service, thus joining the ranks of Sir Lancelot, Sir Galahad, and more recently Sir Mick Jagger. But before we begin jousting with this philosophical knight, it is important to go over some of his basic convictions. Ross doesn't include these convictions in the reading, he just manages, in true unhelpful philosophical fashion, to wait until the end of the reading to do so. First, then, in the latter pages of our assignment, W. D. Ross admits to being what we call an ethical intuitionist. This is just a fancy way for agreeing with the cowboy's advice that you gotta go with your gut. For us, though, our intuitions about ethics are not only accurate, they give us nothing less than moral facts. In other words, according to Ross, my ethical intuitions give me knowable information about morality, in the same way my senses give me knowable information about the world. I can know what is wrong, just as certainly as I can know that fresh coffee is hot. So then, it's fair to ask, if we already know through moral intuition what is right, what's the point of ethics? Fair question, and it brings us to the second basic feature of Ross's philosophy. Namely, for Ross, ethics does not show us what we should do. Our intuitions do this already. Rather, ethics for Ross attempt to describe what is going on when, for instance, our intuitions tell us that it is wrong to bomb civilians in wartime. In this way, reading Ross is not so much like reading an instruction manual for proper living, as it is like reading a paper by a biologist classifying a newly discovered genus of frogs. So, having established these two basic features of Ross's ethics, let's move on to his argument, keeping both features in the back of our heads. Much of Ross's argument that we read for today consists in disproving other ethical systems rather than describing his own. It's sort of the philosophical version of that time-worn yet ever-rich phrase, the best offense is a good defense. The first party on which Ross turns his philosophical fists is utilitarianism. Now, we'll be covering this school of philosophy soon, but for now, all we need to know is that they believe that what makes an action right is that the consequences turn out for the best, or to put it differently, that right action is that which produces the greatest good. Last week, we saw why Kant thought this couldn't be the case. Today, we'll see why Ross disagrees with utilitarianism. Ross begins by throwing a term at us. Namely, he says, instead of saying produces the greatest good over and over, how about we just call producing the greatest good optimific? Sounds like a way to describe an overenthusiastic sixth grader, but it works. Using this new term, then, what utilitarians are ultimately saying is that what is right is optimific. Now, Ross continues, there's only three ways utilitarians could prove this. First, they could show that right and optimific simply mean the same thing. Second, like a science experiment, they could demonstrate that right actions produce the greatest good. Or third, it could be that it is intuitively apparent that right actions are indeed optimific. First then, suppose that right and optimific simply mean the same thing. If this is the case, then the terms would be interchangeable, like the terms unmarried male and bachelor. You got one, you've got the other. But this isn't obviously the case with right and optimific, Ross argues, because say you could either keep a promise or break it, and by breaking it make the world a slightly better place. It isn't obviously clear which action is right, even though breaking the promise would lead to the production of the greatest good. Therefore, right and optimific don't seem like they're interchangeable terms. There are times when we get one, but not the other. All right then, what about proof number 2? What if we can demonstrate that the two things are the same, like in a science experiment? A little more reasonable, Ross replies, but this isn't going to work either. You see, science works because we can record the results of our experiments. But we can't do this with our actions because each action has so many consequences, we could never be sure of all of them. There's no way, in other words, to tell if an action actually does result in the greatest good, and therefore no way to scientifically demonstrate it. Strike 2. The utilitarian's last potential argument is to say, well, maybe we just know intuitively that the right thing means producing the greatest good. Well, not really, Ross replies, and begins listing off algebra-like equations. If you don't get these, don't worry, that's not the point. What Ross is trying to say with all this mathematics is that all these equations showing that promises make the greatest good seem kind of irrelevant. We know already that it is good to keep promises without needing to write a math textbook. In other words, our intuitions, if anything, seem to tell us that the production of the greatest good is irrelevant to an action being right. With this third and final argument swept away and utilitarianism thus beaten to the corner, what are we left with? If producing the greatest good in the world isn't right, then what is? Well, we could go with Kant, who, as we have seen, claims that what makes an action right is that it was done for the sake of duty. The problem with Kant, as Ross points out, and many of you have probably noticed, is that Kant doesn't always map onto real situations. It seems okay, for instance, to break a promise to meet a buddy for coffee for the sake of, let's say, saving 3 children from a burning home. And as Ross, remember, believes that intuitions like these are absolute facts, the fact that Kant doesn't sit right with them is more than enough reason to throw him out. But maybe not all the way out, Ross goes on. He can't stay in the dining room, Ross seems to say, but maybe we can let old Kant finish his meal in the kitchen. Indeed, Ross seems to like Kant's idea that duty makes actions right. Maybe it's just that this idea needs a little tweaking so that it sits right with our intuitions. And so, Ross comes up with what he calls a prima facie duty. Now, don't let the Latin here throw you off. Philosophers love using foreign terms. It's sort of the equivalent of the wide receiver who dances through the end zone after a touchdown. When you see prima facie duty, you should simply read potential duty. A potential duty for Ross is a duty that exists not because of our reason, as Kant would have it, but rather because of our relationships. For instance, I have a duty to keep promises because I made a promise to a particular person, and so on. The reason we call them potential duties is that we don't always have to follow them. And no, Ross doesn't mean that we can just do whatever we want. In fact, there is only one reason for not following our potential duties. And the reason is, it's been overridden by another potential duty. Think again about the example I just gave. Ross has to say that it is our duty to keep our promises, and therefore Kant has to say that it is our duty to keep our promises, and therefore wrong to save the kids from the fire. Ross, on the other hand, can say, sure, I've got a potential duty to my friend, but I've also got a potential duty to help others. Since it's pretty obvious which duty is more important right now, it is therefore right to save the kids. And thus concludes Ross's ethics. He believes, and I tend to agree with him, that his idea of potential duty is pretty good at describing what we mean when we say that a right action is right. We mean that we were acting according to a relationship-based duty that holds more sway in the current situation than any other one of our potential duties. This said, remember that for Ross, it is not our ethical theories, but rather our ethical intuitions that are ultimately the bottom line. Like a scientist, Ross would be willing to change his ideas about ethics if any of the facts change, if the theory doesn't continue to sit right with us. And sitting right does indeed seem to be what ethics should be all about. Because if ethics is the science of living well, then we had better be able to live with what it says.